If you've ever visited the International Schools Services website, you may have noticed at some stage that they added a button at the top that said, Start a School. The button's now moved to the bottom of the page, but it's still there. For me, it always felt like that line from the movies, I wonder what happens if I press this button. Well, Dave McMaster is a brave soul who has pushed the button on starting a school not once, but 3 times. I think it's fair to say that Dave knows what happens. Dave started 2 schools in Hong Kong and 1 in Bahrain, where he's currently the head of school. We asked Dave to take us on the journey of starting a school. I was hoping to gain some insights, and Dave did not disappoint. His straightforward, humble style of storytelling effectively painted the picture of the joys and challenges that can arise before, during, and after a school starts up. Dave McMaster has 35 years of K-12 education experience, primarily in leadership roles across Canada, Hong Kong, and Bahrain. He joined the Esol organization in Bahrain in September 2018 and led the founding team in establishing and constructing the American School of Bahrain, which opened its doors in September 2020. The school began with just over 100 students amid the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's grown to nearly 800 students in its first 5 years of operation. Our guiding question for the episode was, of course, how does one start an international school? Here are a few of the topics covered in the episode. Reasons why new international schools are being built. Who are some of the parties behind the new schools? Some of the various buckets or categories of work that you need to plan for in starting a new international school. Some of the headaches and heartfelt moments Dave experienced when starting his current school. And advice for any person or organization thinking about starting an international school. This show was recorded on February 16, 2025. Enjoy this engaging episode with the authentic, self-effacing director of the American School of Bahrain, Dave McMaster.
Hello, Dave, not David. David, that would be me. Welcome to the podcast, and we always ask our guest, where in the world are you? So, Dave, where are you?
Hi, David. Hi, Audrey. I am in Bahrain, which is sort of like Singapore, I guess. It's a city and a country. I'm in Bahrain, and I've been here for 7 years, or my 7th year. It is actually raining today, one of our 5 or 6 days of rain a year, which is great. Yeah, I'm actually at work at the American School of Bahrain.
Well, speaking of rain, I was in your neck of the woods in the spring of this past year where it did rain, and it rained a lot, so our planes could not take off from Dubai, and I got to spend 4 days in the airport. So a little connection there on rain and the Middle East.
Yeah, I know exactly when that was. I strategically was in Dubai. Our parents here could not leave our parking lot at the end of the day because there is almost no drains here because of so little rain, except for that time in the spring, and we were flooded. Not the school, but just outside.
What a difficult situation for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. These stories with the not great drainage in places where it's typically dry reminds me of a couple of times in Saudi where we had, we've had closures in Canada for snow days. We've had closures when I was in Addis for water days, because if the water shut off, you can't use the bathroom. So, it just becomes a hygiene problem. And then in Riyadh, we had rain days where the school was closed because nobody could get through the underpasses and stuff because they were just flooded out. So, yeah, this is familiar to all of us.
They have the greatest snow/rain days here, and it's usually a celebration. In fact, we just had one a couple of weeks ago where the national men's football team, soccer, football, won the Gulf Cup, which is very prestigious in the Middle East. They were not expected to win, so the king gave everybody the next day off. There was no work, there was no school, it was sort of like COVID, only essentials, hospitals and pharmacies and grocery stores. It was great.
Great to be the king.
Mm-hmm. It is.
So I'm in the kingdom of Thailand, and we've got a wonderful king here as well. So we
Mhm.
could go tangentially a long way here, but I think let's bring our going global story back to something specific that you would like to share, Dave.
Sure. When I think of a snapshot of going global, I still, 22, 23 years later, have regular moments of scratching my head thinking, how did I get here? What am I doing in Bahrain? I was in Hong Kong for many years, and a good friend of mine who's works for the same organization as I do right now, Esol, he's in Cyprus now after being in Egypt, after being in Hong Kong. And we would have many times having a glass of wine, looking out over Happy Valley in Hong Kong, going, how did we get here? I think my going global moment was serendipitous. I was a very young high school principal in Vancouver. I was really fortunate to be in the position. I actually even knew it at that time. Usually you figure that out after the fact, thinking, oh my gosh, this is so hard. Then years later, you think, wow, that was a great job. It was a great job. It was a school of about 1,700, but it was a work to rule year. Nothing like Ontario had gone through, with all my friends who went to the same university as Audrey at Queen's, who all went back to their town that they lived in, almost all worked in their own former high schools, and had to endure some pretty ugly work to rule and strike years with certain governments. And we were going through a work to rule year. And at 38, I guess I was in my fourth year as high school principal there, and I really loved it. I was back in living in the neighborhood I grew up in, working in a different neighborhood. And I went into my boss and said, we've thought about going international since the day I left Queen's University in 1989. A gentleman who Audrey would know, who's unfortunately since passed away, Alan Travers. And I said, Alan, I'm really interested in going into international education. This is 1989. He said, well, get a couple years under your belt and then think about it. And 13 years later, I walked into my then boss's office and said, you know what? This work to rule is not why I got into education. I've got great coaches and drama teachers who aren't able, even if they want to participate. This was in the spring of 2002. And he said, there's a guy that used to be the director of schools in Vancouver that I worked with. He's heading up some school in Hong Kong. He might have some information for you if you're ever looking. And I'm thinking, wow, you're making it pretty easy. Are you trying to get rid of me? And he says, no, 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 no. But if you're ever thinking, anyway, a phone call, a cold call later, and a conversation led to an interview in Hong Kong. A month later, led to us selling our house, our 2 cars, and purging just about everything we had, thinking we were going for 2 years. And the only reason we sold our house was it was an old character home that my wife had redone most of the inside. And she just couldn't stand the thought of somebody living in our house. So we sold it. Sadly, the real estate rates in Vancouver climbed for the next 22 years, but
Of course.
we're happy anyway. Yeah. And so I ended up in Hong Kong. And after 10 months, I phoned my boss and said, take away the acting title of the lady who's replacing me, because I'm not coming back right away. And that was 22 years ago. And I think about that a lot in terms of just this sense of adventure I think I didn't realize I had at the time. And there's nothing more, like you guys know, than going global than that first step. And it's been a whirlwind since.
What a fantastic story. And I love that you said, Alan said, get a couple years under your belt, and
Mm-hmm.
13 years later,
2 kids.
uh-huh,
Mm-hmm.
you still had the idea in the back of your mind, and you
Definitely.
acted on it. And that's great. And it's also just testament to the community of international educators and just how wonderful it is
Mm-hmm.
that you were able to reach out to that person, a cold call, and it ended up with a complete change in your life. It's just
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah.
It's what we love to hear. So our guiding question that, has been burning in my mind for years, ever since I saw that button on the International School Services webpage that said start a school. And I thought, oh, what'll happen if I press this button?
Mm.
But our guiding question is, how does one start an international school? Because, a number of times we've had friends, at a party or whatever, and we're like, oh, if only we could start our own school, you'd be the math guy, you'd be science, and so on.
Mm.
It would be so cool. So how does one start an international school? I have a first sub question here.
Yeah.
What are some reasons why new international schools are currently being built?
Well, I think over the last probably 15 to 20 years, the main reason, it's not the right reason, but the main reason is if you do it well, it's very profitable. I remember sitting at AAIE in San Francisco, probably about 2007 or 8 or 9, and there was a panel of for-profit school owners. Ironically, the people I work for now were sitting at that table. I didn't know it at the time. And you had a couple of hundred principals, vice principals, heads of school internationally, all with the head shake at the beginning. Yeah, right. For profit school, which is in our minds counterintuitive. Somebody's counting pencils. Your teachers are going to be low paid, etc. That's changed, I think, quite dramatically. It's still the same in some places, but I work for a for-profit school with a family, and it's 100 times better as an administrator for me than working with a volunteer board of governors where bureaucracy often gets in the way of progress and innovation. And if you have the right owners. But so I think it's big business for starters. And I think in many countries, and I'm not going to specify, it's not like that here, but in many countries, the impetus starts because families are not happy with the local system or the public education. Certainly in Hong Kong, it was really a colonial approach locally, sit, get, and spit. You sit, you get your information, you spit it back, you memorize as much as you can, you go to school for your friends, not necessarily to learn or to learn to learn. And I think so many international schools do that, and that's why they're being built, and they continue to get a higher percentage of schools around the world. But certainly there's a money aspect to it. But yeah, it's that time warp of education in so many places. Generally speaking, educators are quite resistant to change. And so I think the international schools are being built because people say, wow, the students coming out of there are really together. They're international, even if they've born and raised in a place like we have close to 50% Bahraini kids. They will come out of our school extremely global in terms of their thinking, and probably more so, even though the local system here is very good, and it's been very good for many years as the Middle East goes. Bahrain school system is excellent. So I think that's the main reason is better quality education. The world's a lot smaller place, and people need, when they are 18 or when they finish university or whatever they happen to do, they need to be more international. And that intercultural understanding that comes somewhat naturally, not as naturally as I think we believe it does, but I think that is a real impetus for parents to put their kids. You don't have an international fee-paying school unless you have people putting their kids in. And so I think that's one of the reasons in many countries.
David, I think this is a cue for you and I to start a school.
I don't think so. I'm enjoying retirement, but I can advise if you want to get one going there, Audrey.
Yeah, sure. No problem.
Yeah, there have been many times that button you talked about, Audrey, that I obviously hit a few times. There are many times and I'm thinking, why did I hit that button? What am I doing? At 3:00 in the morning, and I'll maybe talk about it later about how we, the journey of this place and the evolution of this place and when we started and the challenges. But it's, there's probably nothing more rewarding than being part of this.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit further. So we've got individuals. So I'm hearing that you're working for a family. And then even before you came overseas, Audrey and I were in the Middle East, and we knew of at least one individual who had schools that were for profit. And then, like here in Southeast Asia, I've heard of ownership by an individual, maybe a partner, something like that. And then when it comes to organizations, I've heard the term corporate. So could you go in both directions and give us some more explanation of what those two groups look like?
Generally speaking, I think they're extremely different. And I can give you a couple examples without saying school names. There's a school in Bahrain, and it's a good school. It is as corporate as you can get. A friend of mine who was hired at this particular school at one point in the past got there, and his first meeting with the owner was increase tuition over the next 5 years by X%, decrease your administrative staff by Y%, increase class size and make parents think it's okay. There was no discussion about curriculum, about wellness of kids, of wellness of staff. This was 100% a business, and a business in that case, and I think some cases, to get the value of the entity or the school or group of schools to a certain level where somebody's going to swoop in and look at this. They're going to get their accountants to crunch numbers and say, we want to buy this school. And then you've turned your few $1 million investment into quite a few $1 million, and you maybe move on to the next. That's, black and white corporate look at things. And they're not all corporations do that, by the way, but it's much more based on a business model, which boards in schools around the world really struggle with, because the majority of boards are well-educated, successful businessmen and women who are often volunteers, almost always volunteers, especially in nonprofit schools, but for-profit sometimes too, who want to approach it with a corporate look. The company I work for, and there are others like this as well, a gentleman named Mr. Abba Chakra, who's close to 90, who was a teacher at 19 years old in Lebanon, Lebanese American, and he has been an educator for over 65 years. That's all they do is education. There is no side business. There is nobody swooping in. They could offer him any amount of money. And he's told his two sons, who I work with closely, one's a former banker, one's a former lawyer that grew up and went to university in the US. As long as he's alive, no amount of money can purchase this, because he did this because he wanted to be. And he's different than me. I was a founder from the education side. He was not only the founder, but the investor when he started his own school in Kuwait in the 70s. In fact, that school is still there, Universal American. They ended up leaving when Iraq invaded in the late 80s. And he wanted to move his family to Egypt. And since then, they've owned and parted ways with a number of schools, but they currently operate 10. That's the model I work in. It's still a corporate model because it's their business, but our discussions have a business aspect to them. My business manager and I put together budget proposals, but at the end of the day, they are ultimately fiscally responsible for the school, and I'm responsible for running it along with my team. But there's nobody counting pencils. There's a budget, but there's nobody saying, hey, we could make an extra $6 if we bought these pencil crayons instead of these ones. That is not what happens. And some of the bigger business corporations, and without naming them, I can think of 3 or 4 that have 10, 20, 50, 80 schools. And there is a framework and a structure and a business plan that you adhere to. And the stuff that I get to do on a daily basis is very different than maybe a person in my position. Usually teachers, if they're happy at a school, it doesn't really matter whether it's for profit or non-for-profit or corporate or non-corporate, as long as they're able to do what they want to do, and that's, meet the needs of students. And so, but yeah, very different models.
So what I'm hearing from earlier is the potential for a value add. That's the focus, a part of the mission. We're going to add value to this community, especially through the lens of being an international school. Yeah. But then I just heard, in dealing with the for-profit, there can be the lens of value takeaway in a way. I'm going to squeeze this entity for what I can. It can almost also be like a startup. It sounded like you get it started and get the buyout. That's the big thing you hear about for young people going into the business world. So all that fits. So one thing, if you could go a little further on the corporate side, what are some benefits of having lots of schools that are value-oriented, trying to do the right thing? I guess economies of scale, sharing information, things like that?
Yeah, we're a great example of that. There are 10 schools that are part of the Esol network. So there are 9 other directors. There are about 1,000 teachers in Egypt, in the UAE, one in Hong Kong, us in Bahrain, Cyprus, and Lebanon. And so the value added there is, when I was starting the school as the operator, I would be on the phone or email regularly to different people within this organization saying, hey, what do you guys do about this? Do you have a policy handbook that I can change that's going to work for us in Bahrain? Huge difference in terms of time and efficiency, but also in terms of, a lot of international schools, in fact, I would say most, are islands. When I worked for the Canadian International School of Hong Kong, outstanding school, there's no other Canadian international school that had anything to do with our school, nor do actually any Canadian international schools, by the way. But you have your colleagues that you can get a hold of that you might have got to know along the way. But there's huge value added. We have a meeting in 2 weeks with the 10 directors and the people who run Esol to look at what are we doing to improve. We just went through an inspection. It's really like an Ofsted British style inspection, but it's a little more sane. It's like accreditation on steroids, and then they give you a report card that the world gets to see. So it's a little bit anxiety ridden for a while. We had so much help from people within the organization that I work with to help us along the way. That's a huge difference than maybe I was in Hong Kong as a principal and head for 12 years. And we had great people and great boards, but I wasn't reaching out to competitors to say, how can I do this better? This is a really healthy way to do it.
So I'm taking away a couple things here. First of all, you're blowing my mind with the school flipping concept. Never would have thought of that. That just is creepy to me. But the other thing that it brings to mind is Dave and I are always encouraging people to do their research and not just get excited about something and jump into it. And it sounds as though what you're saying is including heads of school, do your research. Who is the board? You know, if you're going to go to a for-profit, what are they like? What are their values? Are they actually educators to some extent? And what is their history? Have they been school flippers, or are they actually people who really do care about education? So this is really eye-opening. This is the kind of stuff I wanted to find out.
Yeah,
So
I would have known none of this 22 years ago, of course. But it's really is quite incredible. The school I was at in Hong Kong, it will never be sold. It's completely nonprofit. It's a volunteer board. It's a world-class school. They have more money in their capital reserve that they can spend on value-added initiatives and the school itself than, small banks. If you do it well, if you're smart, if you have people with wisdom running your board. But yeah, I can't think of any better, and you guys have done this a long time, better piece of advice than, and people that are maybe 24, 25, 26 who are eager might jump in without doing the research. I think when I interview, which is my favorite part of my job is recruitment, people who have been around a while, if it was the three of us looking for a job, there's a lot of things that need to be ticked before we would consider it. Most younger people they'll look on Search Associates or some of these very good recruiting firms saying, oh, this is what I can save a year. This is what I can make. And I don't think there are too many of us that got in here purely for the money. But yeah, research is so incredibly important in reaching out. More than 50% of my hires now are through contacts on my staff, because a teacher that's teaching English here, let's say a teacher teaching IB English and middle school English, and we have posted, which we have, an English position, it's way more authentic for her or him to be talking to somebody saying, one, this is what it's like to work at the school. This is the opportunity for growth and development. And two, this is the lifestyle that you can live or not live here. Way more so than me, Dave, the head or director, interviewing somebody and really wanting to hire. Now, I think I would come across as authentic, and I hope most heads do, but you're not always getting what you're told. So you really do need to reach out and research for sure.
Well, let me ask more about that accountability. That really gets my interest, because we were just interviewing Mark Lewis and we're talking about all of our experiences. Yes. With, we just keep spending time with lots of Canadians. And I'll say to our audience, as an American,
Shall we sing the anthem?
I'll stand.
I like it. I like it, being with these Canadian people, good people. So we were talking about going from school to school, Audrey and I, and it seemed everywhere we went, they'd be starting the curriculum process. And we probably could have gone over other systems that weren't in place. And then the side of too many initiatives, and then initiatives fizzling out because they, in a business sense, they were not implemented well, and they didn't put in systems to measure how well they were doing. And that's so much of my career. Yeah. So with this kind of report card that your school system does, and I'll call it a school system, do they get down into the teaching and learning, not just the finance looking, but saying, okay, last year you put in a new system to support the growth of your teachers and give them feedback. Okay, how did that go? Show us how you did that. So the accountability would come into play.
Yeah, it's a great question. I won't go into the whole story because we don't have enough time. I said no to this job for a year for the exact same reason that you've just posed as a question, is who is operating the school, me or the owner? And after 12 years in Hong Kong at a great school and 10 as head, We had a governing board of 25 and a founding board of 18, and it's a recipe for absolute disaster if it goes south. So at my stage in my career, when I came here, I was asking the questions you just asked. In fact, I put a few provisos on it saying, the day that you come in and tell me that I can hire this teacher and I got to get rid of this teacher because somebody in the community said this or that, I'll point you to my desk and my keys and I'll be on my merry way. I'll pay for myself to head out. And we have some very, very open, blunt discussions about that. And I can tell you 6.5 years later, they have been 100% loyal to what we had talked about. Doesn't mean we don't have arguments. It doesn't mean that, like, I'll give you a quick example. We're looking at offering dual language, Arabic and English, across our early childhood instead of just one offering in each class. I would be remiss if I decided, along with my team and my incredible early childhood principal, to make that decision and say to my bosses, hey, by the way, we're going into dual language for all. That would not be responsible. That's a big shift in terms of the direction of the school. In the end, in fact, they're coming here next week. We will have that discussion. So from their standpoint, at the end of the day, their most important job is hiring and firing their director. And more importantly, allowing their director to run the school and operate the school within certain parameters. But yeah, they finance 100%. Ultimately, they are responsible legally for the school, along with the investors that have invested in the school. But they are not the operators. But those big decisions absolutely have to be decided. But they allow me to make 90% of those decisions. And the big ones, like a curriculum change, if we say we're not doing the IB diploma anymore, we're going to move to the AP system over the next 3 years, I absolutely should be discussing that with them and the board. It's a small board of 7 people, those kind of decisions. But whether or not I'm going to hire one of you two to be my next IB coordinator, or whether I'm going to ask a student to leave because his or her behavior has progressed to a point where it's just not safe to have him in the school, I might ask for advice, but I'm not going to ask them to make the decision. That's really important. And for people in my position, or maybe aspiring vice principals, because you got to be careful what you say and when you say it. But I think in terms of the operational reins that you have, you need to be ultimately responsible for what happens on a daily basis and what the vision and mission is about for that school. So why it took me a year to decide, I needed to find out about the family. I needed to have many conversations, because it was a 30-second conversation to start in about 2016. I was working for a different family at the time in Hong Kong, and they asked me if I'd be interested in starting this really great project in Bahrain. I said, no interest whatsoever. And it was in person. And he says, wow, that was fast. And I said, well, the only thing I know about Bahrain is Michael Jackson used to hang out with the Crown Prince, which is true. And I think it's an island, which it is an island. With my geography degree, you would think I would have known that for sure. But I said no. And I let them know, I said, I don't know anything about you guys. I don't know how you run your schools. I've heard of you before, but I don't know enough. So that question that you posed of who's got the reins of the school is so incredibly important, not just to the director and the leadership team, but it trickles down to the classes and how the classes are run and what autonomy you have as a teacher. And if your team is allowing you to take risks and make mistakes and fail like you want students to, and you don't want the sit, get, and spit model of education, we better have teachers that are going to grow. And I've always said, if you don't get better while you're here, then we haven't done our jobs. And that doesn't happen if the owner, the board, etc., are trying to drive the train and not just being on oversight of finances. A long-winded answer, sorry.
But very clear and fantastic information for anyone who is looking to go into a headship or looking to move schools and considering a for-profit school, to just really, really make sure that you have a sense of who those people are.
Yeah, just one caveat to that. I think in simple terms, and I think as we get older or maybe more experienced or mature as educators, hopefully we have a clear understanding of what we would want for not only our own children, but children in school. And does our mission and vision align with who I'm working with or for? That at the simplest form. And that has to be some alignment. It doesn't have to be exactly aligned. And I can say with the people I work with now, they want the same thing I do ultimately.
Well, and then also to your point about the ability to pivot quickly if everybody's in agreement, and your chances of everyone being in agreement seem to be kind of higher because they're already to a large extent on the same page with each other.
Right.
And if you're on the same page as them, that just really sounds like it makes it a lot easier to be agile. And as you said at the beginning, education and educators can be a little bit, inertia
Mm-hmm.
bound. So that's really good to hear too. As long as you've got a sense of direction, you're not, Dave and I have also talked about the whole initiative fatigue piece.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as you've got your mission and vision and everything, and you're running your school with integrity,
Yeah.
that sounds like a wonderful way to run things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, people who have read your bio will know that you've been instrumental in the founding and development of 3 international schools. As you said, you keep pushing the
Mm-hmm.
button and then sometimes wondering what prompted you to do that. But tell us a little more about some of the various buckets or categories of work that you need to plan for if you're starting a school.
When I left Canadian school and I was approached by a family in Hong Kong, 2014, I announced in 2013 I was leaving. So 2014, I had no clue how to start a school. I mean, I was an educator and I had had lots of experience making decisions, from a principal or a head of school standpoint, but really I wasn't really understanding. And in retrospect, what I really realized that I had to do, or if anybody is, you've got to be comfortable with the unknown because things can change. And I've lived through, as I had 2 pandemics, one in Hong Kong with SARS and then COVID here, and we couldn't have been hit harder, but in a positive way, crazy enough. And so I think you've got to train your mind not, and I'm not good at this, I've gotten better over the years because I have a mind that just constantly goes and goes. It's probably a little bit of I would think ADHD, but which I think has worked for me over the years. But I think you really have to come to terms with the fact that there's going to be some calculated risks and some guessing along the way. And you can't be afraid to say, I have no clue how to do this, and I need to reach out to people. The 2 schools in Hong Kong were very small schools. They were both sort of early childhood kindergartens that we literally started from scratch with a family who had never done school. So they were relying on me, and they gave me the flexibility to do research pretty much for a year on early childhood and approaches, etc. But certainly you need to be able to be comfortable in the unknown. Even as David said, going into schools that are 3, 4, 5 years old who are still designing their curriculum or still trying to figure out policies and procedures. When I hire people, I say, you've got to be okay with understanding that not everything's there, that you're going to have a lot of gray area that you're going to have to deal with. And it might be a behavior policy that's not even appropriate for the school you're in, but you needed something. And so that's really important. And having good people to work with, obviously, that was, as I said earlier, that to me was the biggest thing. And in both cases, the schools in Hong Kong and this one in Bahrain, which is obviously on a much bigger scale, having people that you enjoy working with, because there's probably no more miserable profession than education if you don't like doing it. And I 99% of the time love what I'm doing, but I've also in these startups realized that you've got to be able to swallow your pride and be humble and understand that at my age 61 there's still a whole bunch I need to learn. And so that to me was the other stuff, the contractors, the building of the school, hiring, which is super important, but those are all nuts and bolts things that I think if you're intelligent and you're hardworking, pretty much everybody can do that. You get, hiring well is a skill, but it's really how do you put your thumbprint on a place and maintain your sanity? Because really, after the 2 in Hong Kong, I said, no way will I ever do a startup. And that's why my answer was very quick to Ahmed, a guy I work with. When he asked me, do you want to do a startup? No. And I said, I didn't know where Bahrain was. And I also don't want to work that hard again. The first year here was great. It was almost like a holiday. Hopefully my employer doesn't see this, but no, they know I was doing a lot of groundwork. They actually had me come 2 years ahead of the school opening, which is almost unheard of. And I did a lot of groundwork ahead of time, found out what parents want and don't want in a school. This isn't a big place, 1.3 million people, but also was on the ground as the place was being built, etc. So that was really important in terms of sort of that bucket of, many times to save money, an organization will bring a principal or a head or director in a couple of months before, and the treadmill is going so fast, you spend a year or 2 just trying to stay on the treadmill without falling off. Whereas I had, a year of real sanity and it was great. But the next year leading up to opening, my founding team and I don't know if we would have collectively had 10 days off, 7 days a week for a year. And it was all great. But in fact, for leave, most of my staff, the 8 of us founding team, they get 30 to 40 days leave a year. I don't know if more than 1 or 2 took more than 3 or 4 days leave at all. They just didn't have time. So the work ethic has to be there too. And you don't do that if you don't enjoy it.
That is some dedication.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So Greg Mancata, friend of the podcast, was in Doha at the start of a school, a science academy. And I remember just being curious about the design of, they started, I think, in just a regular building, and then they were designing the school. And it was so interesting to see what it looked like and how they were dealing with the heat. And he had a picture of what it would look like, and it was going to be by the big football stadium from the World Cup. So what about the design aspect? In the last 20 years, so many very modern, purpose-built, let's hope they're purpose-built, schools have been built. So when it comes to design, what are some factors you would advise someone to think about in that process?
Well, I was sort of thrown into that. The design was done before I started. I did have the opportunity, though, to talk to the contractors, and we did make changes before the school was built. But in my design of a school, if I was an architect, which would never happen, schools are really easy to cut corners. Narrow hallways, smaller classrooms, the areas that don't have bums and seats paying tuition, like cafeterias, gymnasiums, swimming pools, libraries, breakout spaces. Those are the areas that are really easy to cut in a school and maybe more typical in a governmental school, even in public school in Canada, because money is limited and resources are limited. The guy that actually designed this was retired. He's designed 5 schools for the Abishakra family over the last 20 to 30 years. He's known for things that I would have had, but he already had them. Wide hallways, lots of glass. Before we opened, they hadn't switched the power from the generator to the grid or whatever it is. And so we had a few weeks before we were opening with no power except for the fact that it was 40 something degrees out, which was very uncomfortable. No students by then and no teachers by then. But we realized we actually don't need lights on in a single classroom in the school because he's done such a good job of utilizing the 300 and something days of sunshine here. And not only that, he built the school east-west, so the sun, for the most part, goes over top and the searing sun doesn't go directly. When you talked about Doha, the sun and the sand are brutal to places. They did such a good job of designing this, and the investors who paid for it, 2 local investors who have much bigger fish in the sea than us, were spec in their investments, and they really only wanted high quality education. And for those who come back to Bahrain and work, they're going to make a difference when they do. And so the design itself was, I've been involved in 3 startups and then probably 2 or 3 serious renovations in schools. And I've never been in a school with fewer deficiencies after being built. And that's because they didn't cut corners. There's 2 cafeterias, 2 library spaces. We don't have a theater yet, and it's a bit of a bone of contention with my staff and their parents because we have a great fine and performing arts program, but a beautiful gymnasium, a regular size pool, another training pool, a full-size pitch, or as we used to call it in Canada or the States, a field, full Olympic track, etc. So we're blessed with a phenomenal, there are very few things I would change here. Where the science labs are, I probably would have put them all on 1 floor instead of 3 floors. That's very minor though. I probably would have had a second small auxiliary gym because we have an incredible, I hope he doesn't watch this because this will go to his head, an incredible activities and athletic director who has just in 2.5 years moved us to the sort of the forefront in the region in terms of our programs. So we have limited space in the gymnasium and the pool, et cetera. But overall, being able to meet the needs of students so they're not cramped into a small space. There's a school in Bahrain that is smaller than this, and they have 3,000 students at it. We have a maximum of 1,250 once we get to that point. And so space is a big one. And thinking well beyond core academic subjects, which in international education is part of your foundation.
So your cap is 1,250. That's interesting because so many schools just grow and grow. I know at Singapore American School, it was always, we really don't want to grow anymore. We really don't want to grow anymore. And then they just kept on growing anyway. So,
Yeah.
but one thing that you mentioned off mic was when you first started up and then COVID hit,
Mm.
how you had hired your
Oh.
teachers, you had your initial students. Can you just tell us that story, please? Because I thought that was really
Yeah,
fascinating.
it's out there. I've talked to parents about it repeatedly because they love the story. As I said, I got hired in 2018. We started building the school in February 2019, and we opened in September 2020. We opened applications, which was very difficult because technically you cannot open applications in a school in Bahrain until you have your premises permit, which means one of the 6 or 7 regulatory bodies, in this case buildings, comes in and says this place is safe for you to have students. That usually doesn't happen until you open a school. We were, through some connections, allowed to open our applications in around, I guess, early February, mid-February 2020. And we were getting 60 to 70 calls or emails a week, mostly asking, oh, we heard there's a new school coming. What's the tuition? That was the main one. And remember, this is a small place. I mean, there's probably more students at Singapore American than there are in Bahrain. And everybody here knows everybody. Literally everybody knows everybody. So we opened admissions and we started doing in-person applications and assessments and meetings with parents. And for the first year or two, I met every single applicant and every single parent, which was incredible. I just can't do that anymore. We're too busy and I'm getting older and don't have the same energy. So we started, and then 3 weeks later, literally the phone didn't ring, and no exaggeration, and not a single email inquiry for I think about 22 days or something like that. And I'm thinking at that time, and I had hired my business manager, my marketing manager, my IT manager, my facilities manager, an executive manager who works closely with me. Actually, pretty much they're all still here. And I did not want to tell them, guys, this isn't looking good. You guys have all left your jobs for me saying, hey, this is going to be a great idea. And we got along great. We were in a small, beautiful office in central Manama. And when that happened, I talked to my employer and saying, what do you think is going to happen? He goes, oh, well, everything will be back to normal in 3 or 4 weeks. Even SARS, when I was in Hong Kong and we closed schools for a month, which seemed like an eternity, and schools for the next 4 months were closed, and then some around the world opened them to September when we opened. But he said, continue to hire teachers. We're projecting 150 students to start, which is a little high, but and he says, how many teachers? And I went through and figured out pre-K to grade 9. That's where we started. And I hired 24 teachers by mid-June. And literally on about June 30th, I sat down with the admissions manager and said, we have one student for every teacher, because we only have 23 registered kids, and none of them had paid a dime because we weren't legally allowed to accept money in a school that had not had their license given to them. So at that point, and again, outside of my own brain, I hadn't said anything to my team saying, guys, we may never open. And I was really happy the 10 or so million US dollars that was used to build the school was not my money. Somebody was going to be upset, but it probably wouldn't be me, although I probably wouldn't have a job. But yeah, so it really picked up in the summer, and fortunately, and we started with about 110 kids, which to me, and I'm sure there are some examples around the world, I don't know how many, is the biggest leap of faith of people ever in schools, because outside of 3 weeks of interviews in person, every single person we met, including every teacher I hired, was on Zoom. And we weren't allowed to have anybody on campus. One, it was finishing being built, and two, because of COVID restrictions. And it wasn't in Bahrain, it wasn't until 2 weeks before the start of schools, which are late August, early September here, that the Ministry of Education came out with what the rules were. So they actually, it was quite flexible. You can open if you want under certain restrictions, or you can do virtual. And so by then, I mean, we had a grade 5 class of 3 kids, and they were all 3 staff kids. It wasn't a really good financial model, but now that same class, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, in 9, there is now 74 kids. And so it's grown dramatically. But yeah, I thought this is a disaster. Like there's no way this place is opening, but it did. And in fact, if anything, Ironically, we probably were at a huge advantage. We grew by a third that school year because so many schools that were fully virtual, because they were full schools and they couldn't put everybody there because of the rules, which were similar everywhere. And the government here, by the way, did a phenomenal job of being transparent. Everybody knew what was going on all the time. And so we had, I think, 45 students transfer from other schools into our school. We're still not very popular with other schools, especially for profit ones, because there's one school we have close to 100 students from them over the last few years. But that year we had classes of 5, 7, 9, 10. And so parents were really comfortable. Okay, well, you guys are obviously going to spread kids out. Still in those early days, we didn't know, nobody really knew what was going on or how this was going to affect us or if it's critical. And, everybody adapted all over the world and we had to adapt. But it was maybe the best thing that ever happened for this school because one, the 24 teachers who came, one came from Louisiana in the States. The other 23 were working internationally somewhere. And I think all but maybe 2 or 3 came directly here from where they were currently working, which, as you know, as educators, that respite in the summer of getting maybe back home or traveling, or nobody could do that. They stayed where they were and they traveled early August, quarantined for 10 days. So they didn't even see the outside of their apartment when they arrived in Bahrain. We had to give them SIM cards and food. They couldn't get food. We had to supply them with food. But they were also probably the tightest group of teachers that I've ever worked with because the 4 or 5 months before, and nobody backed out of their contract. That's not true. One did. And it was the best big league sports trade in the history of trades. I had hired somebody for X position, I won't say what, and I hired somebody that when she backed out from the States because she was worried about COVID, I hired maybe one of the top 3 educators I've ever worked for in my life, who's leaving us, unfortunately, because he's been promoted and he's getting a deputy head of school. But yeah, it really brought people together in the founding team who's still extremely close. And I think actually, I don't know the answer. I think out of those 24 teachers from 6 years ago that were hired, I think 20 are still here. There's been very little turnover. So yeah, so it was, I think we took something, and you talked earlier about building a school or the bucket, and that's, having flexibility and patience and resilience more so than ever during COVID. It really strengthened everything that we're all about. And I think to this very day, I think it's a big part of our success is just that closeness and that bond that the community too, the parents here and the students. I think that's been hugely beneficial for us.
I think there's also maybe a factor too that anybody who's willing to take a job at a school that isn't started yet probably has that flexible kind of mindset, that ability to flex that you were talking about earlier. So that may be part of also what has made it so successful. But what a great origin story. It's just fantastic.
That's, international educators in general, except for the sort of 2 and done, they all have to be somewhat flexible. And that's why almost 95% of everybody I've hired here have all worked internationally. Makes a huge difference.
Absolutely.
All right, Dave, that is quite the sharing of struggles and heartfelt moments and the power of community going through a struggle and becoming even tighter, and just the nature of international educators and the power of community. So I hope our audience appreciates that, because there's a chance almost wherever you end up in a lot of places in the world, you're going to hit some bumps in the road. And almost every case, you're going to come together as a community. And as Audrey just said, you're going to flex even more. All right. With that said, one last question on this guiding question is, what advice do you have for any person or organization thinking about starting an international school?
Well, I look at it from 2 sides in terms of starting a school, and I still almost segregate myself as an educator versus an investor, or even a community of parents where it's a nonprofit, either side. I think you really have to, my advice would be, spend the time on deciding what it is you want. What are you trying to achieve? And I know the school that I'm in right now, one of the things that helped me make my decision was they flew me into Bahrain for 48 hours. In fact, I remember almost none of that entire 48 hours because it was so quick, except it was very warm. But anyway, 2 of the people, actually, they're both on our board. They're 2 of the 7 people who grew up here, both really super bright. We haven't talked about Bahrainis or the local culture, etc., but you've just got so many really bright, humble people here. And these were two of them who graduated from a school here, which was a Department of Defense school that 20 years ago there. We have many of those parents. And they talked about, to me, what it is they're hoping for their own children in their education in terms of that mix of Middle Eastern values and even the tenets of Islamic religion or Muslim religion, which I knew nothing about at that point, and nothing about religion, but just what people value in terms of family and how you treat each other. And if you are in the small percentage of privileged people in the world, how important it is that you give back and that you're responsible for this in one way or the other. But they wanted to combine that with the approach of a North American curriculum and pedagogical approach where students have a voice, where they have an opinion respectfully. And so I think anybody starting a school, whether it's international, independent, private, religiously affiliated, etc., you really got to decide what it is you want. And that includes those who are for-profit organizations, because if you don't really know what it is you want and what you're trying to achieve, and that gets down, I guess, to the nuts and bolts of mission and vision and pillars. I was very fortunate to write our original pillars, and one of them is actually happiness. In our vision, the word happy is there. And when I talked to these two gentlemen, who one was MIT, one was an Ivy League school, so they're bright guys. They would never let you know it, though, because they're too humble. But they talked so much about the emotional side of children and how they develop and their characteristics. They had no interest in hearing about, how many people do you think we can have by the third year? How many years do you think it will be before we break even or the investors break even? They didn't care about that. They care, but that's not what the dialogue was. And that really helped me say, okay, I've met the family and I know them. Mr. Abishakra is about as focused on schools as any human being can get. And he's a true visionary. Took a lot of risks over the years, a lot of risks. In fact, we don't have time, but some of the things he did for the benefit of his own staff in times of crisis, including in Egypt. But you got to know what you want. And it's not just the 12 or 15 or 20 words of your mission, but it's truly in your heart. What are you about? What are you hanging your hat on? And that can go different directions once you start. But anybody starting a school, whoever the community is, educators, non-educators, really decide, what is it we want now? What do we want in 5 years? What do we want our students to be doing in 20 or 30 years? Not what jobs, but what do we want to be defining them as people? To me, that's the most important and most critical thing, because regardless of curriculum, regardless of the investment, if you don't know what direction the bus is going, and you're not focused on what you believe is important, and you're not going to be successful as a for-profit or non-for-profit. And you're not going to be successful academically, and kids aren't going to go to great universities around the world. They're not going to have multiple opportunities, and they're not maybe going to be giving back to their community. So those kind of things, that would be the most important thing I can say. It's from my little bit of experience over the last number of years in startups, is really know what you want.
And you're dealing with business people, so they've probably read the book Good to Great, which deals with the values in an organization and how can you extend them and support them.
Yeah. Is there a way maybe our listeners could follow you if they want to hear a bit more about starting a school?
I think the easiest way to get a hold of me is through my LinkedIn profile, Dave McMaster. If you send a friend link, I'm really, really bad at this, but I will do a better job of. My marketing manager is always on to me. Yes, this is a great way to promote you, can promote the school, etc. And she's right. But LinkedIn would be great.
Okay, perfect. So, Dave, this has been just fascinating for me. I feel like I've lived a little bit vicariously here following your journey. You're a great storyteller. So thank you for that, and for really your quite frank sharing of some of the difficulties and everything. It's not all roses, but thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us.
Well, my pleasure. And Audrey, it's always good to talk to you. And David, nice to speak with you. And I look forward to a second segment.
Cheers, Dave. Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com, And join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.